One button WoW is here, it works, we've played with it, and it's actually shockingly good. It may even work for you, and for a lot of people it's, funnily enough, going to increase their DPS, even though the penalties for using it are kind of humongous. So, it works, but maybe not for the reason that you might think, and in a way, we've all misunderstood what Blizzard really wants this feature to be. Since our last video, Blizzard clarified what this feature is supposed to be and what it's not supposed to be. The short version, right, is that it doesn't play the game for you, it doesn't use your cooldowns, it doesn't change targets, it doesn't do anything that basically isn't just damage. It's less a one-button play WoW and far more just one button does your DPS rotation. So you still need to swap targets for priority, press cooldowns at the right time, use defensives or interrupts, all that stuff. If you're ranged, you still need to do optimization around movement for hard casts. Basically, you still need to play the game. The difference here is you don't need to be thinking about your next damage button all of the time. And when you realize that, that's when you realize Blizzard's actual plan with this feature. This is an accessibility feature, sure, but it's actually not just that, and I'll walk you through a real-world example. So, while doing delves with the single-button assistant to help put this video together, Matt found that the game was just far too easy. He was really bored, it was slower than normal, it was just an extremely boring experience. And then he started to worry. If people play like this, then it could be bad news. What if they get bored as well? But he forgot to factor something in. So, take a look at the screen. This is boredom. On the other side of boredom, there's anxiety. Now, if you ask many players what they feel when they do a Mythic Plus, anxiety is probably the answer. So if Matt, a very experienced player, went from flow to boredom, then actually this might be the anxiety killer that WoW has needed. And that's a pretty heavy thing to start with, so let's just dig into why, and how this kind of seems like a crazy solution, but there's a little bit of genius to it. So here's what's in your brain when you're playing World of Warcraft. Your brain on WoW. The slices might be different sizes, but this is generally it. You've got your rotation, you've got what's going on with your character, what's going on around your character, what's going on with everyone else in your group, and then most of us have got that last little slice that's full of random background things. What am I going to have for dinner? What am I going to have for lunch? And big things like, will Blizzard do a world revamp after The Last Titan? Now, if that all gets too full, you start to feel overwhelmed. And we've all basically been there. You end up so focused on your damage that you didn't notice that you're standing in the fire and now you're dead. Or perhaps the complete opposite. You're so focused in doing a mechanic right that we completely mess up our cooldowns, mess up our DPS rotation, and feel stupid. Both instances, both examples there, are attention problems. And the single button assistance, some would say genius, I suppose, is that it shrinks this slice, and that leaves the brain a little bit more free for some of the other slices. You're free to look at your health, the world around you, enemies, what they're casting, basically the whole rest of the game. Using this will then let players who struggle, right, with staring at their bars, actually play the rest of the game. And in Blizzard's grand anti-combat add-on revolution, it actually helps to kill even more birds. If you can pay attention to the game, then maybe you don't need weak ores or GTFO to blast an air horn at you whenever you stand in the fire, because funny enough, you'll have noticed you're standing in the fire. But this may seem like me glazing it to the point where it could actually kill the game, because I do think that if this became the default, it would be bad, right? So this is not for everyone. This is only for people who don't master their rotations. In practicing skills like, say, a guitar, playing tennis, or even a fighting game, the end goal is not being able to do something once. It's one step further. It's to be able to do something repeatedly without having to think about it. It's learning until you hit a stage that psychologists call automaticity. You might know that as muscle memory, and if you've ever been on a long drive and just totally zoned out, but somehow, you didn't crash your car and kill everyone, well, that's how. Automaticity. Muscle memory. If you're a dedicated player of WoW, you've already learned your class at this stage, right? And that makes the attention slice from before that goes into playing your basics far smaller. All, of course, without adding, a damage penalty. So, what this really is a shortcut to reaching that same stage of attention, where you're free to focus on the actual encounters and the world, but with a damage penalty for taking it. And that brings me to the next thing. Just how bad is the damage penalty? The answer is, this is actually where the video gets real interesting. Since it was announced, some have been trying to figure out how much damage it will do, as in damage per second, not damage to World of Warcraft. So, Arch over at Wowhead spent the weekend running tons of warrior sims and came to the conclusion that this is very, very punishing. Using the single button assistant loses Fury in arms between 20 and 25% damage. That's from 2.8 million DPS if you play perfectly, all the way down to a mere 2.2 million DPS. Using a very primitive way to compare player skills, he also figured out that you'd need to press the wrong next button about half the time to do that little damage. That all sounds pretty bad, but it's a sim, right? The sim is basically perfect play. And World of Warcraft is not like that. It's not a game with what we in the day would call patchwork bosses anymore. We've got, say, bonus damage windows, ad spawns, forced downtime in basically every fight. And that means that sims don't account for playing around all of those different things. So, also considering that a dead player does literally no damage and how much attention using this frees up to do other things like dodge swirlies and press defensives, I actually expect, or I think that Blizzard expects, that the single button assistant will be a damage buff in many cases, not a nerf. And actually, this isn't just conjecture. We can take a look at Warcraft logs for proof of all this. What you're looking at is a range of damage dealt on arguably the simplest boss, Lock and Stock, on normal difficulty, because that's more the player a feature like this could be targeting. Now, we've locked it to a small item level range so that gear matters less, and just look at the huge range here. Looking at just arms, players in the lower quartile are doing much less than 75 to 80% of the possible damage that, say, Sims would suggest they could play, or just what other players prove they could do in terms of damage. All this means is that if those players stay alive because they can focus on staying alive and maybe even use their cooldowns at smarter times as well, then using the one button option should bring them all up. And this is especially the case looking at the most popular spec, Ret. Just look at that gap, it is huge. Realistically, people will make mistakes even with this, but this should help for quite a lot of people. I mean, the stats kind of bear that out. This may be you, it may not be you, but either way, I think Blizzard's plan is that this kind of just buffs everyone. And not just their damage, but their ability to play World of Warcraft. Do you ever complain about there being way too many keybinds? I think that's an element here. One button WoW quite obviously solves a lot of that problem. Most classes will be able to save between 7 and 9 keybinds using this, and for most specs that brings you down to needing under 30 to cover absolutely everything. And that means you'll be able to put your defensives, interrupts, and utility on extremely easy and fast buttons, which of course feeds into using them easier in actual content. With accessibility concerns then, well, fewer keybinds can help, but for even the most hyper-casual content, right? Just pressing this one button and occasionally your major cooldowns will basically be fine. You'll also be able to throw away your weak auras, right? Even the cooldown manager. Just stick a few buttons in the middle of the screen instead for, I suppose, some sort of super minimal look, right? You could do that, and do you know what it would be perfect for? Well, laid-back controller play. I think it'll get quite a lot of use for that, especially if, perhaps when, WoW comes to consoles. There's other benefits too. These might crop up after launch, like, say, opening up more builds for talents. Because, yeah, you absolutely know that best one-button build will be a major search term on YouTube and guide websites as soon as this thing ships. And that's going to create a feedback loop. Some simpler builds that people would never even bother theory crafting now may do better with one button than some of the complex builds right now. And that might mean that, sure, mostly you're going to be dealing with a 20% DPS increase, while maybe with a build fully optimized for the one-button rotation, maybe that would only be a 10% DPS increase. And if that is the case, it has major implications on how Blizzard decides to design and balance this game. Another thing is people using this as a fight practice tool, right? So do the first few pulls of a fight using one button so that you can learn the fight's timings, and then swap back to your full focus DPS after you've got used to it. You can see a lot of use cases here, but you know what? Enough is enough. Even I'm beginning to feel a little bit sick. So enough glazing this. Let's take Blizzard's ideas down a peg, because there are downsides. Here's the big, huge flaw of this feature. It's a shortcut. The games industry has argued about this every year or two, pretty much on cue, since Dark Souls came to the West in 2012. Letting people take shortcuts means that most people won't push through any challenge or frustration. If you don't have shortcuts, well, people do end up pushing through and they end up finding satisfaction, as the likes of, say, Elden Ring show us. That's kind of just true, right, for learning. Now, if you put this in-game, it's probably going to decrease, right, the people who learn specs and learn to love WoW's gameplay. You could certainly make that argument anyway, that if there is just this button that deals with the whole problem, and people then rely on that button, they'll never really learn the real thing. If you want to truly doom, you could say that this is the first nail in the coffin of WoW's high skill ceiling gameplay, and I totally get that point. And there is some truth to it, there is a price, but Blizzard are betting that that price is actually worth paying. I think from their side, people who love the game as it is aren't really the problem, right? Or people who say really want to do Mythic or Mythic Plus. They won't use this feature. But what this feature will do is improve the quality of life for the people who do decide to use it. That could be people who don't find those parts of the game interesting currently or don't find it approachable. It could also be cohorts and cohorts of new players who are put off by complexity. At least I have to imagine that's a lot of what Blizzard are thinking. Plus as well, just, literally, it's an accessibility feature. But here's the thing, that's future speculation. What we have found in our testing is real problems right now. There are quite a few issues. Like, say, how it benefits melee way more than it benefits ranged. Using this as a ranged is actually a complete nightmare because this system does not care if you are moving. So, that means, as a marksmanship hunter, right? If you're moving and trying to mash this button, all that'll happen is it will just get stuck trying and failing to cast aimed shots. That won't really be good for your DPS. And since you don't know what's coming up next, you can't plan for that either. So if you fully rely on this, you can't know an instant GCD is coming up to pre-move, as one example. And the same goes for any range spec, really. Unless you learn how, you'll just have forced downtime, which melee obviously will not have to worry about. The same problem also applies for multi-dotting and for target switching. If you need to multi-dot, well, you have to understand why and when yourself, because this feature doesn't really solve those problems for you. Though, that said, with abilities like Vile Taint, what a name, and Shadow Crash, Blizzard already have a solution to that problem. So we can at least infer they're thinking about it. Now, the other problem is tanks and healers. Oh boy. So theoretically, it will help with tanks. It'll simplify their damage rotation. Their damage realistically doesn't matter a great deal, and that means they can focus on actually tanking, which does sound like a good thing. The GCD penalty might be even worse here because it can eat into resource generation, which will of course lower your defensive uptime. That's kind of rough. So it's probably not worth using as a tank unless you're using it as just an accessibility thing, in which case it would make sense. With healers then, it's a bit of a different story. Simplifying a DPS rotation into one button could go a long way to solve the massive keybind issues that healers face. Seriously, they have so many binds, it's kind of wild. And that may help some healers either start doing DPS or at the very least stay focused on health bars enough to stop whenever they need to. But either way, this makes playing DPS the correct answer for more players who don't want to put effort into learning the game. If you want to play WoW the easiest way, well, this is the easiest way, and it works best for DPS. That could make the tank and healer shortage even worse than it currently is. But again, only time will bear that out. Then finally, we've got some specific issues that will be a complete nightmare for Blizzard to work out, and mages are maybe the worst here. So all three specs have got some sort of fun quirk to play with. You've got Frost working around Flurry's travel time for extra shatters, Arcane uses Barrage travel time to optimize a damage window, and Fire uses some old crit grace window tech that's insane to boost its hot streak procs. That's all pretty important stuff. And the assistant works only around the fire one, at least in our testing. Doesn't really work for the quirks of the other two mage specs. And that does raise a whole ton of questions about what this is supposed to be. It's obviously not a teaching tool because it'll just teach you the wrong lessons. Not that you see the logic anyway, as in the logic behind its decisions, so that makes it a bad teacher in the first place. So not good for teaching. It'll definitely help you to learn fights by moving your attention towards the fights, but definitely it will not help you learn your class, and there are some classes that it really does struggle to play. Okay, time for the verdict. Basically, for experienced mains, this is not going to be worth taking. We always knew that. I never even thought about using this for my main specs. No, it just doesn't make sense. Just knuckle down and take the time to actually learn your spec properly. And that is pretty much always what I would recommend. Now, if you absolutely don't want to do that, or if you find yourself struggling a lot on fights or dungeons, well, there are many ways in which this will help you out. This isn't just Blizzard's way of adding accessibility, but it's more leveling the playing field between low skill and high skill players without ruining what makes the game actually fun for either type of player. That is very much the Steelman case for this, but we will have to see how far all of that goes. Because look, if it's only a 10% hit once people work out the best build for one button WoW, well, 10% hit from what like an optimal sim would say an optimal build could do, in real world scenarios for many people, that will actually mean more damage. And that could start to create feedback loops that could influence how the game is designed, influence how all of this is as we move forward. So let me know what you think. Do you plan to use this? And if you want the scoop for Blizzard's whole broad plan about basically reducing the need for add-ons by building loads of things themselves and making them a default part of the game, watch this video next.